I want to talk about a very serious subject tonight, but I'd like to introduce it with some material that I hope will be so pedestrian and so obvious that it won't call for comment. That might not happen. It might be controversial, even in this sort of neutral setting. But if it is, I think we're good to try to come to an agreement, if we can, about how to understand it. Right. Here's a slide which some people go through in some contexts, not all. Here's the way the slide goes. Everyone's human. Every human being can make mistakes. No matter how big a genius he is, no matter how big an expert he is, he can make mistakes. So, it's perfectly appropriate when he takes a position for me to think about it, analyze it, research it, and come to my own conclusion. I don't think that the last part follows from the previous parts. From the fact that he's human, it does follow that he can make a mistake. I would say even more. From the fact that he's human, it should follow that he does make mistakes. But from the fact that he makes mistakes doesn't mean that I'm qualified to find one, identify one, and verify that it's a mistake. That doesn't follow. Maybe what follows is that I should expect perhaps controversy with other experts on an equal level. I remember when I taught the Einstein board debates when I was at Hopkins to my students as an example, and the students would always ask, so who's right? I say, who are you asking? Asking me who's right in a debate between these two gigantic geniuses and experts of the whole field? I'm trying to enrich my life a little bit by understanding a little bit about the disagreement and the discussion. So let me give you an instance of this and see if we can agree on how to approach it. Let's take a person who's a third-year medical student. He's taking a course on accidental injury. And in the book, it says, when you're confronting a particular type of accident, this is what you should do. Professor teaches what's in the book. Student goes to the professor and says, I don't think that's right. Seems to be, you got to do something else. So he describes his idea to the professor. The professor says, look, this feature and this feature mean that you're making a mistake. And he says, I don't agree. I don't think you're right. So they resolved together to write to the author of the book and to put the student's position in front of him and see what they get. They write to the author of the book, and the author of the book writes back, what I wrote in the book is correct, and here are the reasons why the student is wrong. And the student says, sorry, I still don't agree. Okay, now, next week, the student's driving down the highway, there's an accident, and he pulls over. This story is from 50 years ago. People would never do that today because they'd be liable and all the rest. But there was a time when people did that. Pulls over, and he sees, by golly, it's exactly the accident in the book. Exactly the injury in the book. Okay, there are two paths in front of our student now. Shall he do what he really believes to be right? What his heart tells him is right? What his understanding tells him is right? Or should he do what the book says to do? If this is a hard question for you, let me make it a little more dramatic. Let's say he does one or the other, and the result is that the victim ends up paralyzed from the waist down. And when he's asked, you treated him, you did something for him, and he's paralyzed from the waist down. What did you do? Which response will be a better defense for him? I did what I honestly believed was correct. Or I did what the standard textbook written by one of the world's experts in accidental injury said is correct. Which will be the better defense, more reasonable defense, the stronger defense? Do we have two views on this, maybe?
Is it dependent on the person that says that?
How would
Does
it
it have to be the student? Let's say it was the expert.
Well, I'm giving you my example. You can give your example to make your point. I chose my example to make my point. I'm talking about a third-year medical student who has not done residency, not specialized, not carried out research. He's a third-year medical student. Okay? He's doing a medical degree, right? I hope it's obvious that he ought to do what the book says. What's the virtue of following what you honestly believe if you are relatively uninformed and unexperienced and uncertified? Who cares whether you really believe it or not? I'll give you another kind of example, and here I find that people are subject to a certain kind of psychological quirk. If you ask a person what he's responsible to do, you often get a very defensive reaction. Don't tell me what to do. Don't tell me what my responsibility is for. I'll decide that. Don't dictate to me how I have to behave. Fine. Okay, so I won't do that. I'll ask, how do you assess other people's responsibilities to you? You hire a babysitter. The baby falls, has an accident. What do you expect the babysitter to do? Do what he feels is best, or call the doctor? When the doctor's available, he can call the doctor. Call an emergency room. What do you expect him to do? How would you want the babysitter to take care of your child? This isn't your responsibility, it's his responsibility to you. You let the guy your car. You say to him, listen, sometimes the brakes get loose. And you can tell because the wheel pulls to the right or to the left. If that happens, go to the garage and have the brakes tightened. And you're going away for a month. Come back and your car is decoratively wrapped around a tree. And you say, what happened? And you said, the brakes failed. The brakes failed? But I told you they might get loose. Did they sound? Did they squeak? Did the wheel pull to the right and the left? He said, yeah, that did happen. So you say, well, did you go to the garage and have them fixed? He said, no, you know what I did? I read the manual online and I did what it said. And they slipped. And your car's wrapped on a tree. You say, will you accept that as an appropriate response? Will you say, oh, if you did what you really think is right, I have no complaints, no complaints whatsoever, perfectly all right, I'll take the loss. I don't think you do that. It's totally unreasonable. Who are you? You read it online? Half the stuff online is false. Or poorly explained. So we all recognize that there's such a thing as expertise, and we all recognize the appropriateness of using expertise. Now suppose the expert tells you something which to you sounds nuts. Is it automatically correct for you to simply discard what the expert says? Let me give you some really bizarre examples. You're a junior in college and you're majoring in the subject, but you have a lot of free courses that, just to fill in your schedule. So the first week of the semester, you decide to go around and listen to lectures, just randomly, and see if you pick up something interesting. You walk into a classroom, and you hear the professor say, this semester we're going to be talking about infinity. Different infinities. Some bigger and some smaller. Oh yeah? Different sized infinities? Are you inclined to go into the dean and say, you got a phony here. You got a phony. He's teaching nonsense. He pretends to be a professor, but he told this stupid, ridiculous idea that there are different size infinities. How can you fire him? It's a shanda. Okay, you understand lineage, right? It's a disgrace for the university. Or you walk into another classroom. We're going to study cause and effect in physics. In particular, I'm going to show you cases where the effect comes first and the cause comes afterwards. Do you run to the dean and say, you have no idea what's going on in your school? Did you ever hear of anything as absurd as the idea that the effect happens before the cause? You need the cause to make it happen, see? So if the cause hasn't happened, the effect can't happen first. It just can't. Now, I hope this sounds absurd to you. What you should say is, this guy who's teaching this course about transfinite mathematics, which is the name of a discipline, has written a book on the subject, and published research papers on the subject, and if it sounds absurd to you, that's the exact right conclusion to draw. it sounds absurd to me. But from it sounds absurd to me, it doesn't follow that it is absurd. In this case, it might be that I am very ignorant, untrained, and unsophisticated. Why do you call a plumber to fix the leak in the house? Why don't you fix it? You don't know how? So what? Look it up online. Get some glue. Pour some glue down the drain. It won't drip. It won't drip. That's for sure. It won't drip. It won't take your water down either, but it won't drip. So, from the fact that he's human, which means he's fallible, which means he has made mistakes, it doesn't follow that I'm qualified to identify his mistakes. When I was living in Eretz Yisrael for 41 years, we had a neighbor who was the doctor, and he told me, every surgeon has killed people. Every surgeon has killed people because he's made a mistake which cost the person his life. So do you say, oh, so I'll tell the surgeon what to do? I hope not. I hope not. Now, you hear things like this. Well, they worship their rabbis. They worship their rabbis. They think the rabbis are God. They think the rabbis are infallible. What's the proof? They do everything the rabbi says. Could the only reason to do everything he says be that I think he's infallible? That I think he's God? That the only reason to do everything he says? You have surgery, and you have preparation for the surgery, and the aftermath of the surgery, and so on and so on. Do you say, well, I'll follow 90% of what he says, but he does make mistakes from time to time, so I'll pick and choose the things that I want to follow, the things I won't want to follow? Why not? He is human, he does make mistakes, but of course you recognize that even though he makes mistakes, you're not trained enough to be able to identify which ones are the mistakes. Now let me push it further. Let's suppose that it's been demonstrated that it's a mistake. Other experts have shown this person up. Other experts have come out with contradictory material, and is the consensus of the discipline that he was wrong. And let's say it happens where, from time to time in the discipline, there are things which they used to believe which turned out to be wrong. It was standard medical practice 150 years ago, 200 years ago, to bleed people when they have fevers. We don't do that anymore because we now know that it certainly doesn't help and it probably hurts. Does that mean that doctors have no credibility because they've made mistakes? There is a statement in Chazal about the rabbis. Meshiv chachamim achor. God turns the wise back. It means he can set up situations which the wise will make mistakes. You yourself admit they make mistakes, says this person from Haight-Ashbury, right? Yeah, we do. We are quite convinced that the rabbis are human and they make mistakes. So why do you follow them? Because when he makes mistakes, he'll get it right 92% of the time. And if I follow my own opinion, I'll get it right 30% of the time. It's a better bet to follow him with his mistakes. And not to pick and choose, because I'm not qualified to discover, to determine, to validate which of the things he says are wrong. So I do everything he tells me because I'm going to be much better off following his package of instructions, of which there are 8% mistakes, than following my own judgment, in which case there are going to be 70% mistakes. I don't have to say that he's infallible to faithfully follow everything that he says. Is this obvious? I mean, is this is pablum, right? I mean, this is should every 11-year-old should be able to understand this. Nevertheless, you hear these charges made all the time by people who have a project of trying to degrade religion, especially traditional Judaism. And these attacks are presented in just the terms that I said. Now, the same thing's true, for example, what people do and whether it's correct or incorrect. And here, I think it's a little more delicate, because here's not a question of whether or not it's right or wrong, because the tradition itself will tell us often that what they did was wrong, but how to interpret what wrong means when it's said about a great person that it's wrong. Felix Mendelssohn wrote a violin concerto, very popular violin concerto. Also, as violin pieces are concerned, it's reasonably easy. It's not a very difficult piece to play. Now let's suppose you hear a performer, a soloist, playing with an orchestra, and he plays the Mendelssohn violin concerto and makes 7 mistakes. Is that a good performance? A bad performance? Depends on who he is. If he's the local violin teacher in in a rural county of Ohio, that'll be terrific. If he's Yehudi Menuhin, it's awful. 7 mistakes in the Mendelssohn? You gotta be able to play that blindfolded, after 36 hours without sleep on steroids. What? That would be a terribly bad performance. If you read in the paper, so-and-so gave a terrible performance, you don't know what that means until you know who so-and-so is. If he's great, one of the world's greats, then a nuance, a kind of slight slip in the wholeness of the phrase could be considered a terrible performance. Toscanini, the great conductors of the 20th century, he had a sidekick, a guy who filled in for him. I think his name was, was a Jewish guy. Steinberg, I think. One night, he's on the road with the orchestra. He said, "I can't conduct today." Why not? I'm not up for it. I'm not up for it. I'm not on edge. I'm not sharp enough to do it. He'd get all the notes right, but it wouldn't have the sparkle. It wouldn't have the charge. It wouldn't have the energy that he puts into a performance. He couldn't take responsibility for it. You're talking about what for him would have been an unacceptably bad performance. 99% of the people who listened to it wouldn't know that anything was wrong altogether. But he had higher standards. So here's the problem. When you read about great people, the patriarchs, the tribes, King David, and so forth and so on, and you read about what they did, and even when there's a mistake, there's 2 attitudes which are extreme, and it's very difficult to occupy the middle. One attitude that's extreme is they're perfect, they don't make any mistakes at all. It only looks to you like a mistake, but if you analyze it better, you'll see that they don't make any mistakes at all. Everything they do is right. There are even stages in the Talmud which are misunderstood to say that. I'll come to them. And the other is, which is far more common, especially among people who aren't frum, and that is the Jewish tradition is honest, and it's open, and it doesn't hide anything, and they're just like your next door neighbor. They're no different, they're no better, they're no not superior, everybody's about the same, real social democracy. Everybody's really on the same level, and everybody should be treated in the same way. Both are incorrect. I would say of the two, the second is more incorrect than the first. How many of the next door neighbors of these great people are we still discussing 3,300 years later? None. They must have been different somehow. They must have made an impression somehow that the next door neighbors didn't make. But it is true, the tradition is open about the mistakes and communicates the mistakes. But then you have to evaluate the mistake, taking into account who they are. So we have a rule, God is precisely demanding of those who are close to him, his righteous ones, to a hair's breadth. So that means when it's being condemned, you could say, this is like Yehudi Menuhin making 7 mistakes in the Mendelssohn Concerto takes 25 minutes to play. 7 mistakes in 25 minutes, that's a very, very small percentage, it's like 1/2 of 1%. But not for Yehuda anyway. That could be a terrible performance. For him, that doesn't make him equal to your high school violin teacher because he made those 7 mistakes. So you have to walk the thin middle line between not deifying these great people, not denying that they could make mistakes, and on the other hand, not treating like their next door neighbor and expecting that their mistakes will be equivalent to the mistakes that not normal people make. Take a paper by Einstein. Einstein was human. He did make mistakes. He himself said he made mistakes. Would you take it upon yourself to read a paper by Einstein and criticize a new mistake and say, I found another one. See, I'll publish it. You made a mistake over here. I think you'd be afraid to do that. Rightfully so. Because you haven't got the training or the brilliance to discover something that's a mistake that Einstein didn't notice. Even though he made mistakes. So, there is a statement that appears several times in the Talmud. Kol misha omer, Dovid chata, Ruvain chata, eino ela tova. Anyone who says that Dovid sinned is making a mistake. Anyone who says that Ruvain sinned is making a mistake. So the incautious reader thinks, they're telling me he didn't sin. Certainly sounds from the verses that describe the incident that he sinned, but they're telling me you're making a mistake. You mean he didn't sin? If you read it that way, mistakenly, then you come to think, well, man, you read those verses and it looks terrible, and they say that he didn't sin, he must really be perfect. It means he must have done nothing wrong. And then you've erred on the side of making them, as deifying them, as if they can't make any mistakes. But on the other hand, when you look at it and you read it simplistically and think, well, in King David's case, it is Rahman al-Islam. It is adultery and murder, or influence murder, causal murder, right? And so you see that King David could do just as terrible things as anybody else. If you have your wits about you, if you have your balanced judgment about you, you ought to resist that on general grounds. That would be like saying that Yudi Menuhin played the Mendelssohn Concerto and made 7 mistakes. I don't believe it. I'd rather believe that the recording machine put in the mistakes than believe that he did it. I know him as a performer. I know the piece. I know it's not a difficult piece. I don't believe that happened. Somebody else's recording got mixed up with him, or somebody threw some water at him in the middle of the conversation. It's not possible that he would make those kinds of mistakes. And the same thing is true with King David. So you look into the verses, and you look into the commentaries, and you find out that she wasn't really married because he had given the following choices now for the aficionados. He had given a bill of divorce to his wife because he was a soldier in the army, and there was this fear that a soldier in the army could either be captured by the other side or could be killed without witnesses, and then the wife would never be able to remarry, so they would give her a divorce paper, and then when they came back, they would be married. So she wasn't married. And the engineering of the death, this I saw in one of the writings of the Achronim, a very brilliant idea. First of all, King David gave the husband a direct order, and he said no. In Jewish law, if you disobey an order of the king, you are guilty of crime that can be punished by death. King David could have had him executed on the spot. You don't say no to the king. But he didn't do that for various reasons. What he did was he gave him a letter. In the letter was to his commander in the field. And in the letter it said, I want you to go through each of the members under your command and tell them that in a battle where we're having trouble, I'm going to give a signal to retreat. Give the signal to retreat to everyone except the bearer of this letter. And then lead your men into a situation where they will have to retreat. Give the signal for retreat. The result of which would be that he, the bearer of the letter, He's the only one who doesn't know the signal. So everyone's going to retreat. He's going to be left open. He's going to be killed by the enemy. That was the plan. But it wasn't really the plan. The plan was really this. Since this fellow had already disobeyed a direct command from the king was sure that when he gives him this letter and says, take this letter to your commander and don't read it, the minute he gets out of sight, he's going to read it. When he reads it, what he's going to do is ditch the letter and move to China. He's not going to die. But he knows his life is in jeopardy here. And that was the way of getting rid of him without killing him. Okay, to King David's surprise, he didn't read the letter. And he ended up getting killed. But that wasn't the plan. So you read the verses and you say, King David is guilty of adultery and murder. You read the explanation that's given, you see it wasn't adultery, it wasn't murder. And then, he's accused of crime by the prophet Nathan, who spins a whole parable, and King David says the person should die, and then Nathan says to him on the throne, it's you who did it. And King David says, Chatasi Hashem, I've sinned against God, and he takes upon himself repentance for the sin. It means there is a sin there, but it's not the sin that you think. So anyone who says David sinned, he's making a mistake because he won't understand what the sin is. That's what Chazal is saying. And the proof of it is, if Chazal wanted to say that he didn't sin, they could have said it much shorter, much quicker, much clearer. Dovid lo chota, 3 words. Not kol misha omer Dovid chota eino ela toet. Why beat around the bush like that? Because they're not saying he didn't sin. He did sin, but you're not going to understand it. You're going to take it at a low, crass level, which isn't appropriate for King David. But there was a mistake. You have to understand that the mistake really was accounted to him as a very serious crime because of his greatness. So on the one hand, he's not perfect. He's human. He makes mistakes. But on the other hand, it doesn't become your next door neighbor either. There's a certain rabbi who's alive today who some time ago wrote an article for a newspaper in which he described Moses, the failed leader. He knows Moses' failures. He's qualified. He can make the judgment that Moses failed. When we have critical statements about these great people, it's because the tradition, which goes back to either prophecy or goes back to what we call Holy Spirit, means divine inspiration, provides us with that information. Doesn't mean that every Tom, Dick, and Harry can read the verses and figure out for himself and then publish it and become an expert on, what Moses got wrong. He would never do it for Einstein. Only Moses, he's just a religious figure, religious free play. Anybody can play the game, and you can play it any way that you want. So this is what I said meant in the title: how not to misunderstand great people. Someone asked me, admired, why didn't you entitle the lecture "How to Understand Great People"? I hope by now the answer to that question is obvious. You're not going to understand them. You're not going to understand them. But there's a big difference between not misunderstanding versus understanding. What's the difference? The difference is this. To understand would mean to have a positive idea what they are and get it right. To misunderstand would mean to have a positive idea what they are and get it wrong. There's the third option, isn't there? The third option is not to have a positive idea. Then you neither understand nor misunderstand. What I'm suggesting is, don't pretend that you're qualified to have a positive idea of what their greatness was. And therefore you can't have a positive idea of whether and how they might have sinned. We have a tradition, and the tradition tells us what the sins are. Are we together so far? Now, there are some people who look at these statements in the oral tradition and they say, I've seen this written actually. The ancient Jewish tradition was more honest, more objective, and more self-critical than the later tradition. The tradition in the Tanakh makes it clear that there were terrible failures, and the later tradition whitewashed it and tried to explain it in such a way that it wasn't so terrible. The later was sort of more pious and less realistically religious. They couldn't abide by the truth of the Tanakh, which laid bare their failures. So it had to whitewash what they did, so as to make them be more heroes than they really were. But that's wrong. And the proof that it's wrong is that the oral tradition also preserves crimes that they committed that you would never dream of from reading the verses. Never. The verses don't even hint that it was a crime. I'll give you a few examples. There was a war of 4 kings versus 5 kings, the times of Abraham. The coalition of 4 kings swept the whole area of the Near East, and among others, Abraham's nephew Lot was captured. Abraham went to war to free his nephew, and he took his 300 plus men, or Eliezer, whose gematria is 300, took the men, and he attacked them, and in one night, with a miraculous victory, he was able to free his nephew. I don't know, I read that story, sounds okay to me. The Talmud says the following: these hundreds of men that he took with him were his students. They were Torah scholars. Don't use Torah scholars for the army. Now, don't tell anybody in the Jerusalem Post that I told you this, because they'll worry about the politics of it. Abraham shouldn't have done that. That's a terrible crime. He used them for an army. Gee, the verses don't give you any clue whatsoever that anything wrong happened there. Your old tradition isn't that forgiving. It tells you, it informs you. They made a mistake. Another example. Jacob meets his brother Esau, and he presents his whole family. And it says the maidservants were there with their children, and Leah was there with her children, and Rachel was there with her child, Yosef, all his sons. But at that stage of life, Jacob also had a daughter. Where was she? And why? If you have your wits about you and you read the verses, you say, hey, the daughter's missing. Okay. Your old tradition says that Jacob was afraid that Esau would see her and say, oh, you're making nice, huh? You want us to be friends. Let's seal the friendship with a marriage. That was very common in ancient times and very common in medieval times in Europe, when 2 governments, 2 states wanted to seal an agreement between them. They would seal it with a marriage. Now, Esau is Dinah's uncle. Even from the point of view of Torah law, an uncle marrying a niece is perfectly okay. So it would have been quite reasonable for Esau to say, give me your daughter in marriage, and we'll have a permanent sealed cooperation between us. Jacob said, I can't let that happen. So he put her in a box and hid her. Now, I don't know about you guys, but to me, that sounds great. Right, exactly right. I would have done exactly the same thing. Chazal say it was a crime. What? It was a crime to protect his daughter from Esau? Yeah, because she could have turned Esau around. She was able to turn him around. And he denied his brother that chance. Whew. I never would have thought of that. The verses don't give any hint to that whatsoever. So don't tell me the oral traditions are whitewash. They're simply wrong. And I'll give you the final case, which is in a certain sense the most dramatic case. The famous case of Joseph and the wife of Potiphar, where the Torah says that he came to the house to do his work, and Potiphar's wife was there, and of course she had already made advances to him, and it turned out that there was nobody in the house except she, and she makes her advances, and he refuses, and she grabs his coat, And he slips off his coat and runs, because, by the way, Ramban says she was the wife of his master. Ramban asked, who's stronger, Joseph or Potiphar's wife? Obviously Joseph. Why didn't he just rip the coat out of her hands and take it? It's incriminating evidence if he leaves it behind. But you don't do that. You don't do that. It's the wife of your master. You don't treat her that way. And he slips it off and runs out. You read that? Great heroism. It's one of our greatest heroes. To resist that kind of temptation. Well, there happens to be a disagreement in the Talmud. What was Joseph planning on doing when he came home that day? One says he was coming home to do the work that he had to do in the house, and he was surprised. The other says he knew very well that she was alone in the house, and he was planning to have relations with her. That's what he was planning, because he had been beaten. His resistance had been crushed. And on his way into the house, he had a vision of his father. That vision of his father brought him to his senses. So far from seeing him as a hero, we see him as a failure. There's not a hint in the verses whatsoever that he failed in that way. That's a big failure. He prepared to commit what in the non-Jewish world is over the sword, is adultery, whatever that comes to, but he was prepared to commit that terrible crime. So it simply isn't true that oral tradition is a whitewash. It does preserve crimes which otherwise would never be recognized. It's a balanced record of what actually happened. So now, let's take a couple where the critic will spin his yarn. You see, you're just protecting them from recognizing the greater transgression, and just spell out how it has to be understood. The Torah says that when Leah died, Jacob took up residence. I'm sorry, let's start over again. When Rachel died, Jacob had 4 wives, 4 women who bore him children. He was attentive to all of them. But his main tent was with Rachel. She was the one he worked for. She was the one he wanted to marry at first. All the others came through circumstances that were beyond his control. So he had no embarrassment in taking and making his main residence the tent with Rachel. Then Rachel died. He then moved in with the handmaid of Rachel, instead of moving in with Leah. The verse says that Reuven had relations with his father's handmaid. Jacob is living with her. This woman is his wife. So that counts as adultery. The oral tradition says didn't happen. Did not happen. What really happened was this. When Jacob moved in with Rachel's handmaid, Reuven said, "This is a gross insult to my mother. My mother is Leah. You chose Rachel, and Leah came only because their father switched the girls in the night, and so okay, fine, I understand that. I understand your main residence with Rachel because that's the one that you were committed to. But she's dead. Shouldn't you move in with her sister rather than with a handmaid? That's a gross insult to my mother." Which, by the way, is quite hard to understand. Quite hard to understand what Jacob had in mind. But that's what he did. I mean, I'll explain something in a minute. But, so what did Reuven do when his father was out with the flocks? He took his personal effects, which were in the handmaid's tent, and moved them into the tent of Leah, as a kind of protest to what his father was doing. That's what the oral tradition says really happened. The verse says he had relations with her. So here's where the critic comes bouncing in and says, come on, guys. It says that he had relations with her. Now you're just whitewashing it. You're just trying to cover it over. You can't stand the fact that your hero made a terrible mistake. But the raw, unvarnished biblical text tells you the truth, and you just have to live with it. Well, let's look at the raw unvarnished biblical text. It records this incident with Reuven, and the next words are, Jacob had 12 sons, and gives them in order. And Reuven is first, because he was the firstborn. And does Reuven suffer any consequences of this adultery? Is he ever held to account? Not really. Until Jacob is dying, and there he gives a pronouncement on the future of the tribes coming from each one of his sons. There he makes reference to it. Excuse me, if he really committed adultery, the reaction should have been immediate. He should have been ostracized. He should have been reproved, like Shimon and Levi when they killed out the people in Shechem. And Jacob says to them, you did the wrong thing. You did something I didn't want you to do. The very fact that the text is silent indicates it's not a comfortable thing to say that in fact he had relations with his father's wife. The oral tradition says the silence of the text is exactly right, because that isn't what really happened. So you say, well, if that isn't what happened, why does it say it happened? The answer is, we want you to understand that for someone as great as Reuven, his moving the furniture is as big a crime as adultery would be for you and me. He's Yudi Menuhin. He shouldn't make any mistakes in the Mendelssohn. Makes one mistake already, it's a bad performance. That's not a standard for everybody else, but the standard for him. So the Torah preserves the moral character of the crime for a person of his stature. It doesn't preserve the literal crime. Similar case, the verses say at the end of King Solomon's life that his wives worshipped idols. So I'm sorry, that he worshipped idols. That he worshipped idols. King Solomon was guilty of idol worship. Really? That's what it says. And the critic says, live with it, Rabbi, that's what it says. Yeah, but you see, in the book of Kings, there's a certain style. When each king dies, it says he either was a good king or a bad king, and often it says he was a good king, except that he did not enforce the rule against bumos, against private altars, which was very rampant in the First Temple period. And it says he was a good king and kept God's commandment, but this one he didn't keep. When you come to Solomon's life, the end of his life, it doesn't mention the idol worship at all. That's a little odd. For other kings, you mention not getting rid of the private altars, and with King Solomon, you don't mention the fact that he's guilty of idol worship. So the old tradition preserves what happened. He made a lot of political marriages in order to cement alliances. These women came from non-Jewish, idol-worshipping countries. Well, you're being married to me, and you're living in Jerusalem with the Jewish people. You live by Jewish laws, Jewish customs, Jewish mores. And they did, as long as he was young enough and strong enough and knowledgeable enough to keep control. But as he got older, and he got weaker, and things were harder to control, and he had other things to be concerned with, he lost track of what was going on with his wives, and his wives worshipped idols in Jerusalem. And because he's King Solomon, it's counted as his responsibility. And for someone like King Solomon, to lose track of your wives and not control their idol worship is written in the text as if King Solomon worshipped idols. Because that's the moral stature for someone on his level. I'm reciting what Rav Dessa says in an essay, Chatoehem Shel Rishonim, the sins of the originals. And this is the pattern that you have all the way through. So, when you talk about the patriarchs and Moses and Aaron and Miriam and the rest, you must resist the two extremes of saying that they're perfect and can't make a mistake, and saying that they're like your next door neighbor. Now, part of this is what I call psychologism. And this is very, I would almost say it's seductive. People do this all the time. They figure out psychologically why it happened. And this is as bad or worse than evolution, because you can always make up a psychological story. And the one thing that all psychological stories have in common is there's no evidence for them. You just make it up. If it's plausible, you say, yeah, sure, that's reasonable. That's probably why he did it. There's no direct evidence whatsoever. So, psychology of King David, and by the way, when I was doing my graduate work at Brandeis University, someone was hired by a college in the Boston area. His specialty was psychoanalyzing biblical figures. Because he had been trained in literary analysis, been trained in psychology, and he made up this specialty, right? Combining the two fields. He only had one little scholarly drawback. He didn't read Hebrew. He was doing it all in translation. I don't know. If you care about the biblical text at all, you at least ought to be reading it in the original. Instead of reading King James or the JPS version. So when you have traditional sources that give you psychological insight, that you can trust. But if you don't have that, then it's just the fad. And of course, when you psychologize somebody, you take the lowest human motivations, because those are supposed to be shared by everybody. And if you explain what he's doing in terms of the lowest human motivations, that explanation is plausible, because you want to see him as no better than you are. So if I can reduce the great man's actions to the kinds of motivations that I have, then he's no better than I am. And then I'm not required to honor him. I'm not required to follow his direction, follow his example. It plays into your weaknesses straight across the board. I want to give you an example of this in this week's Parsha. I'll tell you something which I don't know why, but very few people know. This week's Parsha is the only Parsha from the time Moses is born in which Moses' name does not appear. Why is that? And of course, the Parshas were divided up by the rabbis. It wasn't given that way at Sinai, and there were different divisions. We finish the Torah once a year, and Jerusalem used to finish it once every 3 years. So the divisions were different. But the division that we have, this is the only parsha in which Moses' name doesn't appear. So the Baal HaTurim says 2 reasons. Everybody knows the first reason, and almost no one knows the second reason. The first reason is, you may have heard, when the golden calf, and Moses says to God, if you don't forgive them, blot me out of your book which you have written. And God says, don't tell me how to write my book. Those who have sinned against me, I'll blot out of my book. Those who have not. But since Moses said it, it should come true somewhere. So what happens is, there's one parsha where his name doesn't appear. When you read it on Shabbos, that whole time, Moses' name doesn't appear. Now it's interesting, the parsha in which this happens is not this week's parsha, next week's parsha, Kisisa. And then the one in which his name doesn't appear is the immediately preceding parsha, because if you go from the one where he said, blot me out, and keep going, then you get to the end and you start at the beginning again and come around the circle. It's the furthest away from the one where he said, blot me out of the book. So the blotting is delayed as long as possible. But that's the first reason. The second reason is that this week's parsha is the instructions for the priestly garments, the clothes worn by Aaron and his children, and forever afterwards, when they do the service in the temple. And the priestly garments are what make the Kohen a Kohen. If a Kohen performs the service in the temple without the garments, it's puzzle, it's disqualified, and what we call in Lomdus, Shem Apsul Izar. The disqualification comes with the rule of not being a Kohen. Clothes make the man. Okay, now, why is Aaron the high priest? Why are Aaron's children the priests? Really should have belonged to Moses. But Moses at the burning bush, when God says to him, I want you to be my representative to save the Jewish people, Moses gives 100 reasons why not. And when God answers all the reasons, after answering all the reasons, Moses says, send somebody else anyway. Shlach no biyad tishlach. At that point, the text says, Vayichar af Hashem Moshe. God got angry at Moses. The Torah does not tell us God's inner emotional life. It's not what it's doing. Every place where it says there was an anger, it means there was a punishment. Something happened. Here, nothing's mentioned. But the next words are, Aaron's coming to greet you, and you come and greet him, and the two of you will take the Jewish people out of Egypt at the same time. In other words, I was going to have you do the whole thing. You're not. You're going to be half. He's going to be half. And the oral tradition tells us that's where Moses lost the high priesthood. He should have been king and high priest. No, that was lost. So, says the Baal HaTurim, here Moses being given instructions how to inaugurate Aaron as high priest. That cost him. He was in pain. He was in pain because his loss was like right before his eyes. To minimize the pain, his name was left out. Not the Pope. Moses is doing this. Moses is doing for Aaron. And he's doing it because he failed and so forth and so on. Because of that pain. So I had a theory that Moses was in pain. I based it on various pieces of evidence. But I always said, I was very happy that I was careful to do this. I always said, I'm telling you how it seems to me, because here are pieces of evidence, but I don't know if it's true. Now I see from the Baal HaTurim it was true. I got an insight, we get an insight into Moses' emotional life. And then you understand that even someone as great as Moses, when he makes a mistake like that, could hurt him. Did he do tshuva? Sure he did tshuva, but so what? He still did the crime. And that pain was with him, remained with him throughout his life. So when the tradition provides a psychological insight, of course, you can certainly trust it. But to invent your own psychological analysis, and everybody does this. You at least ought to know the whole Tanakh. You at least ought to know all of the oral tradition that's written on the Tanakh before you hazard something like that. And since nobody who's in a position or the temptation to do this has that kind of scholarship or that kind of mastery, it's a totally incompetent kind of discussion. Questions? How not to misunderstand great people. Don't credit yourself with a positive idea that you understand what they are and what they're doing. The tradition tells you, then you have some picture that you're being given. You could even be skeptical that you understand what the tradition is saying. Yeah.
You mentioned that in the First Temple period, people had private altars. Were those altars idolatrous?
No.
So
maybe some were, but that wasn't the problem. The problem was they were offering sacrifices to God, according to the Jewish law, except that when the temple is standing, you're not allowed to have private altars. And from the time you got to Jerusalem, then even after the temple was destroyed, you couldn't have private altars.
But before that we did?
Yes. When we first came into the land of Israel, they did. When Shiloh was destroyed for, Shiloh was there like 370 years. It was another 50 years until 30 years, I don't remember exactly, years where there was no central piece of ways of worship, the private altars were allowed. Only when they came to Jerusalem, they became permanently disallowed.
What would have been the motivation to make a private altar?
To offer sacrifices. Sacrifices are a great part of how you connect with the Kodesh Baruch Hu. The Rambam has a whole thing that how much the Torah minimized sacrifices. Private altars were the rule everywhere where you offered sacrifices. There was no central place of worship, the only place where you could offer sacrifices.
Would it have been a mitzvah baba avera, like that they're trying to do the korban to Hashem?
It's very tricky. It's very tricky because you don't know whether they got credit for it or not at all. At a time when the Bamas are forbidden, depends upon what they thought they would do. I don't think. Let's think for a second. Was it forbidden? I don't think it's kosher. This probably is ABCs. I don't think it's kosher. You didn't do any mitzvah at all.
They didn't realize that, or they felt spiritual by doing it, and like they had some kind of pleasure, so that motivated them, or.
Look, you're asking what were people like 2,800 years ago? So, and shall we psychoanalyze them? But I don't think it's too far from people today who who rationalize. I know the doctor said this much, but it won't matter if from time to time I don't. After all, it's probably on the average that it works. It doesn't have to work with every detail. There are all sorts of things that people tell themselves about it.
But how grave a sin was it to have a private altar? Was it like on the level of kares or?
I don't think it was kares. You see, if you sanctify an animal to be brought in the temple, and then bring it on a private altar, that could be kares.
Because it's hektish?
That's right. It's real, and then shchutei chutz carries kares. But here, the whole point was to do it outside, so it was never a kodesh at all, really. So it's a play acting.
I think I heard once that goyim could make private altars to Hashem if they wanted to.
They can up until the present time. They have no prohibition whatsoever. They have that option.
You should go ahead.
But